All right, we're live. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the show and we'll get going. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Single Player SaaS. This is the podcast where we talk about how a single developer or small team can go out and get started in a SaaS and be successful. Today, I am talking to Michael. Boy, I should have asked how to say your name before the show.
Zuercher.
Zuercher. I should have just gone with it because that's what I was going to say. Anyway,
There you go.
we're here with Michael Zuercher. He's calling in from the wilds of South Dakota. And you run a company called Prismatic. Just to give people a little bit of an idea before we dive in and get your story on how you built this software as a service, incidentally, which serves software as a service.
Yeah.
So Prismatic allows people to build integrations between their the different things that people want to connect to. I'm thinking of it kind of like Zapier, except it's within the app and it kind of allows you to plug and play all the different pieces that people are going to want. So you get that seamless integration without somebody having to go set it up. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. So Prismatic serves SaaS companies and we help them connect their products to the other products their customers use. We do that by providing a platform that our customers can embed in their own software. And so you can think of it a little bit as, if Zapier is essentially saying your users have to configure it and set that up, Prismatic is saying, how about instead SaaS companies offer native integrations, which obviously many do at this point. So it's a little bit of a like native SaaS-based Zapier, if you will.
Yeah, you explain that better than me. You must be doing it.
Yeah, it turns out after a few years you get pretty good at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm always fascinated with how these companies get started, right? And so it sounds like you found a niche, SaaS products. You've got a service that people want. Hey, I'm building financial software, and so I want to connect it to my bookkeeping software, or I'm building a sales system and I want to connect it to my banking software or whatever. How did you come to this? Like, how did this get started?
So Prismatic is actually the second company that I've started and run. I previously had a software company that did software for law enforcement. And so we sold to 911 centers, dispatch centers, sheriff's offices, police departments, things like that. I did that for 16 years and grew it to a decent amount of scale. We were 50 million of revenue or so when I left, and ended up selling it to private equity and leaving. But along the way, we built about 600 integrations. That's an interesting market because it's actually pretty different state by state in the United States. And so you kind of have like a different package of integrations in every geography you're in. And that equates to a bajillion integrations. And so we built tons and tons of these, and it was very inefficient. And we felt like we never solved it very well. And we looked at our competitors, and they were at least as bad as we were. And so, it just felt very much like there has to be a better way. And we went out and we tried to buy a better way. We tried to buy a platform to do this for us. And we looked at kind of the integration platforms of the day, Boomi, MuleSoft, etc. And what we realized was they did a lot of really neat things, but they were solving a different problem than the one we had. We were trying to connect our product to the other products that our customers use. Boomi, MuleSoft, you mentioned Zapier earlier. They're all pretty focused on, being purchased by an IT team or something like that to tie together internal systems. And although there's a lot of overlap in those spaces, they're more different than it seems for a lot of reasons. And so we never did end up at my old company. We never did end up bringing anything in. We just kept building them natively. I left and then teamed back up with a couple of really key executives from the last company and started Prismatic to basically say, we're just going to go build the thing we wished we could have bought back in 2016, 2017. And, here we are today, 5 years after starting Prismatic. And we've essentially built that vision, plus all the things we learned from customers along the way that diverged or added to our own personal experience.
Yeah, it's funny because you're talking about this and I'm having flashbacks because what was it, like 14 years ago? I worked for a company that ingested law enforcement data and then gave them tools. And so I understand a little bit of that space and how that works. And, some of the, we had to play by the rules for multiple states, for federal, we had to do different things with the data, things like that. And anyway, it's funny because somebody else now owns the public facing website and has rebuilt what we built at crimereports.com. But Yeah. Anyway, and then yeah, you're talking about these integrations, and um, I told you before the show that I did some work. We were using one of your competitors. By the way, that their system was rather clunky. So
I don't
I'm
know if
not
I'm
I'm not
sorry.
gonna
I guess I don't know if I'm sorry to hear that or happy to hear that,
I'm not gonna name them out. I haven't used Prismatic, so I can't say that you're better or worse.
yeah, fair enough.
Um, but yeah, yeah, it's definitely a thing, right? Because in the case of my contract, what people were doing, or what we were doing, is we had different systems that were using the platform that I was working on or working for, to manage some aspects, and then there was overlap with the things that we were integrating with, but they were good at other things too, and so they just wanted consistency across all the platforms.
Yep.
And so it wasn't necessarily a feature add so much as, hey, we're going to use these systems for these features, but we want everything to look the same across the map. And so, yeah, I understand the pain you're solving. Um, so you get in and you're bringing in these people from your old company to pull this together. And it sounds like you were scratching your own itch. And I know that a lot of companies or a lot of folks out there will tell you, well, you have to go validate your idea and X, Y, and Z. Did you do any of that? Or did you just say, this is a big problem and somebody's got to need it solved?
So, I mean, after 16 years, excuse me, of running a software business, I certainly had met some other folks in the space. And so,
Uh-huh.
we did a bit of validation. Admittedly, we didn't follow probably the letter of the book or whatever for how you're supposed to do
Right.
some of that. I think we had a fair amount of belief in the vision of this product
Mm-hmm.
and of the problem. We validated it a little bit and then just drove forward. And we were fortunate that we were able to, because of previous exits, we were able to bootstrap this thing for a long way, and that kind of gave us the freedom, I guess, to build the way we wanted to for a little while and start validating with early customers and go from there. So we did a bit of validation. We probably did not do what they would teach you in some startup boot camp somewhere.
Yeah, fair enough. It's funny because the more I talk to people, the more I'm finding that, yeah, a lot of people don't do that. They just go for it. Or, yeah, like they've been around long enough and they've talked to enough people that it's okay. This seems like I have a reasonable chance of success, and so I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
The other question I have, because it sounds like you also had some people that you'd worked with at previous companies that you brought in. How big was that initial team? And related to that is, how did you choose who to bring in and when? Because I see people and they're like, well, I don't want to bring on a partner, right? Because they've heard all the nightmare stories, or they're afraid, to grow too quickly because they're afraid they can't. So I'm kind of looking for that roadmap if you've got it, right?
Yeah. So the founding team at Prismatic was three of us. It was myself,
Okay.
a woman named Beth, and a guy named Justin. Beth was my chief of staff at the last company. Justin was my VP of engineering for a great portion of my time at the last.
Well, there
company.
you go.
Yeah, so not a super complicated equation there. They were two people I just couldn't imagine doing this again without, basically.
Right.
So we worked. I don't remember the timeline exactly anymore, but I think we probably spent 5 or 6 months, just the three of us, kind of figuring out positioning, figuring out a name for the company. Just a lot of that, doing a bit of validation, to your point, building some really simple proof of concept stuff, and then we hired up an engineering team, a very, very small team. That reported to Justin as our CTO. And I believe that original team was four developers. And so, that was kind of the team then that carried us through, I guess, what I would consider MVP in hindsight.
Okay. So what are kind of the critical skills that each of you had, or what was the thing you brought to the table, right? Because I'm thinking, okay, I'm the tech guy. I mean, I can do some of the marketing, but I don't have all the skills, right?
Yeah, I think obviously Justin brought to the table the tech side, and is one of those really rare people who is a good leader, a good business person, but also very deep technically in some things that were really relevant to what we were doing. He also experienced the pain probably more viscerally than anybody else in our last company.
That's true.
He was the VP of engineering for 12 years or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but so at any rate, he owned that. That's obvious. Beth took on marketing very early on. She'd always done some of that in the past company until we got to scale, and that became a separate thing. So she had some experience there and learned a lot in the first year or two here at Prismatic. She still owns the marketing function to this day. And then I don't know what I do, I guess. I ran the sales function early on, got us to about $1 million in revenue, by being just a founder-led sales.
Right.
That is probably not my strongest suit, but I do it. I guess I did it well enough. So we got to that point and then brought in a real sales leader. So I guess I probably am the guy that wore a whole bunch of different hats. And I think I, also provided some of the structure and the vision for where we need to get at different times to kind of, realize the vision of what we're doing.
Gotcha. So you all get together, you decide you want to do this, you start, putting the pieces in place, what are we going to call it? What are we going to do? What's our positioning in the market? Michael's going to go be the pretty face and sell all the stuff. So at that point, then, are you looking at revenue models or raising money, or what's kind of the next step?
So, in a product like Prismatic, it all comes down to whether the thing actually works or not. And it's a very evaluated purchase in that product management needs to be on board. That makes complete sense. And then developers or somebody in the development team needs to be on board. Well, you've got two pretty different personas there that are both pretty used to doing pretty deep analytical evaluation. And so, the bead that we had from very early on, and I know this flies in the face of, some of the guidance out there in, generally, we believed that in this market, we had to get a product that actually kind of saw enough of the vision end to end that you could get developers on board with using it. And so, we didn't, the reality is we didn't spend much time that first year worried about raising money. We were very fortunate that we had previous exits and were able to bootstrap, but we didn't really think about raising money. We knew it was, in the future if we got there, but first you got to get there. So we didn't really worry about that. And we didn't worry, we didn't worry a ton about, things like revenue models really early on, because we had to build a product. Now, we did some evaluation of the total addressable market and price points and made sure that this thing would act like that it would actually square out in the end. But we saw so much of success or failure in this market as, can you actually build something developers want to use? And that's easier said than done, I think, especially in products like embedded integration platform. And so that's where we put, I would say, 90% of our energy. And I think that proved out pretty well.
That makes sense. So let's say that somebody else is coming along and they're wanting to build a software as a service. Do you recommend they follow that same pathway? I understand there are caveats and it may not work for everybody, but generally have a working prototype kind of idea. Is that a good place to start, or should they be doing some other things in your special case?
I think there is no better way to tell your story, tell your vision, whether it's to investors or early customers, than to have something that you can use as a prop that actually works. And I think depending on the market you're in, that can be simpler or more complex. I think in some consumer-facing things, you can use mock-ups. In some, this is not, admittedly, I've done this twice, so I have a very small sample size. But I think in some complex markets, nobody really is very interested in what you're doing unless they can touch it and feel it. And the faster you can get to that, the better. So you got to keep the scope really small.
Right.
But even with a really small scope, if you've got a team of, a total of 7 people or whatever, it takes a little while to get something built. And you learn a ton along the way that, informs your view of the market.
Yeah, I like it. And just to give another example on this. So I have a few ideas that I want to build. One of them is that I haven't found a podcast player that I'm absolutely in love with, and I have ideas on what that looks like, right? And so initially I was doing mock-ups, but the problem is that the mock-ups didn't really it didn't shine the way I wanted it to, right?
Yeah.
And so, I'm kind of liking the idea of building an app. Now, does it have to be fully featured and fully functional to show it off? Because I'm thinking like Kickstarter or something, right? Not necessarily, but I can build the UI and move through it, right? At a minimum, right? And so, you're talking about, keeping the scope small. So I have something that is visually functional, but not necessarily completely functional. And the Kickstarter is, hey, let me build this app. Do you have any other examples of things that people can do to kind of pare that down? Because it also feels like you want to get something out fast so you can get feedback, so you can start addressing the market.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot based on market, is my suspicion. As
Hmm.
another example, in my first company, we were in a, what's essentially an ERP and a CRM for law enforcement.
Right.
It was called records management and computer aided dispatch and all these different things,
Hmm.
but it's really basically a giant ERP, and it's a very, very broad solution. You serve everybody from the police department to the 911 dispatcher who needs a dot on the map to say where the fire truck should
Right.
go. And so the way we did it, not with any foresight, but just the way it worked out in that company, was we basically built chunks of that functionality for like for our first few customers. So like the first customer needed one of what became about 9 big chunks of the product.
Ah, I like that. Okay.
The second customer needed 2 more. And so they said, we love what you did with this first thing, but we need these other 2, or like the suite of software doesn't work if it doesn't include everything we need.
Right.
And so that was very painful in that company. We were completely bootstrapped, and I was a 19-year-old
Hmm.
kid when I started it, so we had no resources. My co-founder and I at the time lived in my parents' basement, and so this was a like without resources build. We were both technical people, so we just kind of built software,
Hmm.
built software. It's the only thing we knew how to do early on. But what it led to was, by the time we kind of like realized we had a real ongoing company here, we had built a great portion of that suite. And then from
Right.
there, we were able to build depth. And that's when we really started, being pretty competitive in that market.
That makes sense. So yeah, so you get in, you got things going, you've got your prototype out there. So how do you get it in front of people then to get them to start going, all right, this is something that I need? And how do you identify those people?
Yeah, so this was a very different. Prismatic was very different for me than my previous gig, in
Right.
that this wasn't really an established market when we got started. Now, we
Hmm.
certainly weren't the first people to think of the idea of, hey, what if you built a platform that software companies could embed for integrations?
Right.
But I think we were part of a small group of companies that kind of saw a pretty similar vision at a relatively similar time. And the category now called embedded iPaaS wasn't called embedded iPaaS in 2019 when we got going.
Right.
And so we kind of had the additional challenge that like we literally didn't know how to describe what we did. We didn't know the words to use. And that sounds so dumb in hindsight, but like we actually spent some of those first conversations with prospective customers just trying to figure out how to explain what we were doing. And and you would get just this blank stare
Yeah.
from a product manager somewhere, and they'd say, well, but like, who are you like? Well, I mean, it took us a long time to figure out how to explain that. It took us a long
Right.
time to find the Auth0 analogy, to your point. And I know how
Yeah.
dumb all of this sounds in hindsight, that we like started a company and didn't know how to explain what we were doing. But I think in some ways that's more common than people want to admit. Companies are very good at rewriting history and very good at like inventing founding
Uh-huh.
stories after the fact. I think it's often a lot messier than people give it credit for. And we were absolutely that. So to answer your question, what did we do? How did we get it out there? We had, an early marketing effort. We had an email list. We did
Hmm.
some really early
Okay.
paid search stuff. We wrote a bunch of blog posts and did all of that. And that had what at the time was a nice lead flow, but by today's numbers would be just abysmal. But we had a trickle of conversations basically. And it was as much like us trying to figure out what their needs were as it was us trying to talk about our solution. And that really went on for that first year or two, because again, we didn't really know exactly what we were building. We didn't know exactly what to call it or
Hmm.
how to describe it. And I think we just got better and better and better at that in that first couple of years.
Right. So learning how to explain it, was that kind of the big turning point for Prismatic, or was there
Yeah.
something else?
So the way we described it at the time was, there was a time where all of a sudden those conversations just got easier. And like,
Uh-huh.
I don't know exactly how to describe it better than that, but like you got you got fewer blank stares. You got you got fewer people who just said, that sounds interesting, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. You
Right.
spent less of the conversation trying to like pull out of them enough to explain it. Suddenly it just got easier. And by that point we were probably nearing 1 million in recurring revenue, but you know, and that kind of felt to us like early product market fit. You got some paying customers, they've got real skin in the game. Now the conversations are easier, and you pretty quickly realize, like, man, if we just now we just need to put some fuel on this fire, because we've
Hmm.
kind of got a message and a product and everything that seems to resonate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
So with your founders and any other people you brought on, are you all based in South Dakota, or are you
So
remote? Or
my last company was completely based in, well, almost completely based in South Dakota. And so those
okay,
first very few hires were, or my co-founders we were in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because that's where my last company was. So that's where
okay,
we were. One of my co-founders moved to Phoenix not long after that. So he's been in Phoenix for a long time now. And
hmm
we've been a remote company since very early on. So at this point, I think, I don't actually know the number off the top of my head, but probably less than 20% of the employees are in South Dakota at this point.
So that leads to another question, and that is, since your first company was all sort of co-located,
Mhm.
right? Maybe you did or didn't have an office in Sioux Falls, but then your current company, like you said, less than 20% is in South Dakota.
Yeah.
What difference does it make in the company? Like, how do you feel that? Because I hear the argument all the time, and it seems like since you've done both, maybe you have insight.
Yeah. So, the last company was a very heavy in-person culture. We ate lunch together every day. We served breakfast every day. It was a bunch of people. We had this beautiful office with 150 people in it or whatever. Like, it was a
Hmm.
very in-person culture. And that all happened organically over the course of many, many years.
Right.
But in the end, it was a very in-person culture. And a lot of the cultural, like, rituals that you do, or just like the way that you manage the business, was just kind of a derivative of the fact that we were in person. Um,
Hmm.
Suddenly, we find ourselves in a remote company. COVID obviously accelerated a lot of that, has made it
Right.
maybe more acceptable, and we've got a lot better tools now for it and things. But it certainly is extremely different, in my view, to build
Hmm.
culture remotely. I think whether you're remote or in person, you have to be you have to be super focused and clear about what you want to do, how that culture should be, and you just have to be relentless, I guess, in the way that you encourage it and the systems you build around it and things. But
Right.
I am convinced that we are, as a people, so less practiced at it remotely that it makes that harder. A lot of the things that we all just know of for generations for how we do things in person are
Hmm.
different when you're remote, and we're relearning some of those things, I think. Um, and I think
Yeah.
we just have to be humble about that and keep working at it. We've got what I think is a very good culture now, but it doesn't come without a lot of work.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, I've worked at companies with offices, and I've worked remote. I've probably worked remote steadily since like 2012.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some things that I miss, right? I miss going to lunch with my coworkers.
Yeah.
I miss hanging out with people, and
Yeah.
you kind of get some of that natural you share knowledge in different ways and things like that, right? There is a level of culture, whether you're deliberate about it or not. It seems like with the remote companies, you have to be a lot more deliberate about it.
I think that's
But
100% right.
at the same time, I mean, I don't miss. So there was the marketing manager at my last full-time job. Well, I guess it wasn't my last full-time job because I picked one up during the pandemic. But the one before that, which was like 14 years ago at Crime
Right.
Reports, one of my coworkers compared him to a seagull. He would fly in, he'd make a lot of noise, he'd crap all over the place, and he'd leave. Right. I don't miss the interruptions.
Yeah. Yeah,
And so,
I think there are definitely advantages to remote work.
yeah.
Certainly, the ability to recruit from all over the
Hmm.
country or all over the world is a huge benefit. I think, as you mentioned, I think deep work is easier to do remotely for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Myself probably included. Um, but man, I miss
Oh,
people
yeah.
getting drinks on Friday afternoon, and I miss winning a big deal and having everybody in person to celebrate it.
Uh
Um,
huh.
Pretty hard to replicate some of those things remotely. And one of the things that we've done, and we just had this last week, is we do quarterly offsites with the whole team. And as we've
Okay.
grown, that gets harder. We're
Yeah.
going to just keep at it, but it's getting to where it's fair amount of logistics. But
Hmm.
if we can all be in person for a few days every quarter, we at least capture some of that.
Right.
You do drinks together, you have dinners together, you meet your team, you meet the other teams that you maybe don't even talk to all that much. And man, talk about another thing that has to be done deliberately. If you just go let an offsite like that happen, people are going to have all the tactical
Hmm.
conversations and do none of the things that build like
Right.
strategic culture. But if you do
Hmm.
it deliberately, I think you can get a really long way.
Right. So you talked about offsite. What do you do between the offsites to build that culture, right? Because you said you have to be more deliberate, or maybe I said it and you just nodded vigorously.
Oh, you're
But
100%.
either way, right. So what do you do? Because I see companies and they're like, we're going to be remote, and they say that's their culture, but in reality, you just have a bunch of silos, and some people play nice together and other people don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of answers to that question, but I'll rattle off a few that come to mind. I think, first and foremost, anytime you're trying to guide a culture is always who do you bring onto the team and who do you move out of the team. Like that is, whether we want to say it or not, that is 100% the way you guide a culture. You say what the values of the organization are, and you make hiring and firing decisions based on them. That's number one. I think, in addition, there are all kinds of what I guess I would call just like a cadence or a rhythm with the way that we operate the business. So we do all hands every Friday, for example, with, most of the team, most times people can come or not come, but it seems like most of the time, 80 or 90% of the team is there. And, and it's just a recap of the week, a recap of what's going well and not going well. I actually don't do very much of that all hands. Functional leaders do some of it. We have deep dives where individual contributors will dive into some little thing that's really relevant, temporally or something like that. But even that heartbeat of just like every Friday, we're going to get together and we're going to see each other's faces on Zoom. We actually just asked a few people in the organization, actually, I think it was last week, like, are we to a size now where we should start rethinking all hands? Should we step back? Is it taking too much time? And it was just a resounding, like, if you cancel all hands, we won't have any idea what anybody else in the organization is doing.
Right.
And I'll admit, I was super happy with that answer because it means we must be doing something worthwhile in those all hands. We also have a pretty heavy Slack culture, like so many companies, both remote and non-remote, do. But we have a very healthy, Slack culture. We've done our best to find the things that people like and lean into them. Like I think that's half the battle is like let things organically happen. But once they happen, then quickly support them and do whatever it takes to keep them going. And I think we've done some of that. We have just the silly things where you can't ever. I feel like I'm unable to predict what's going to catch on. But we have a plant parent Slack channel where people who have a bunch of plants and love their plants post their plants. Like, what have I ever dreamt up having a plants Slack channel? No, but like that's become some subset of our company that feels some camaraderie with that. So let's lean into it. It's got its own Slack channel now, and whatever. And I think that's half the battle is let things happen organically and then double down.
Makes sense. So this show is mostly focused on the early on stuff. And I think that what we're talking about is important just from the sense of hopefully when you're building your SaaS application, eventually you're going to scale at least some, right? You may have the idea, I don't want to get bigger than 5 or 6 people, right? I interviewed Ben from Honey Badger. They've got like 5 or 6 people in their company and they've been around forever, right?
Yeah.
And they just didn't want to grow bigger, but maybe you do. And so knowing, hey, as we grow, we're going to do some of these things. We're going to have to make some of these decisions, but let's back way up and say, okay, so initially there were the 3 of you. You're all in South Dakota. Was it the one co-founder moving to Phoenix that precipitated the remote deal? Or was there something else that made you make that decision? And once you'd made that decision, what did you do early to make it work?
Yeah, so Justin moving to Phoenix, I'm trying to remember the timeline here. Justin moving to Phoenix certainly accelerated becoming remote. That said, from day one, we had essentially talked about how we were always going to end up remote if we were going to build the company we wanted. Because big surprise, you're not going to find the talent it takes to build this business just in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And so we had that premise from literally day one. I don't think we really had a timeline in mind. And then between Justin moving to Phoenix, we had another team member move, strangely, also to Phoenix, coincidentally, and then COVID.
It's warm down there.
Yeah, it is. It's very warm, and it's cold here in the winter. And so people, I sometimes think they didn't experience August in Phoenix before they decided to move to Phoenix. But to each his own. But at any rate, that kind of all conspired, I guess, to accelerate it. And we had a little office here in Sioux Falls. That lease, we actually went fully remote even before that lease ran out, and then at some point just didn't renew the lease.
Okay. So yes, you get things rolling. At one point you mentioned something about getting to maybe $1 million recurring revenue. I've worked at companies that had $1 million recurring revenue that were not profitable. So I'm kind of interested in the discussion between, okay, this is how we grew our profits and our, and other things, or revenue, I guess is probably a better word.
Yeah.
And then how did you compare that to how much profit you're making? How do you balance that with growth? Right. Some of these things where it's okay. At what point do you hire? What point do now we're profitable enough to raise money, or now we're profitable to get, angel investors in interest, or I don't even know.
Yeah. Yeah. So for us, again, we had the resources to bootstrap it for a long
Right.
time. So that kind of changes that dynamic a little bit, perhaps. But I can certainly speak to our experience. We always said we're going to build a product that kind of proves that there's a market here, and
Mm-hmm.
get, whether it's get a few early customers or just get to the point that you have a lot of conviction around what you're doing, whatever. And then at that point, we said, we'll raise a seed round. These words get bandied around. You can call them whatever you want, but kind of raise that first chunk of
Right.
money that comes from somebody other than the three founders. So we raised a little seed round, and my thing has always been like, at each of those milestones, you figure out where you need to get to next to feel like the journey is worth continuing, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that curve gets steep, later on, because you have to get to where, like, you're seeing some real traction to give you the conviction that you can become a scaled business before you're going to go raise a Series A or Series B or something. But at least in those early days, we wanted to build an MVP. We knew we weren't going to be profitable in those early days because, it's just not a market where I thought that was the right play. It's a big total addressable market. The right answer, in my view, was to go build the product, go take the market, go define the market,
Right.
and just make sure that structurally you're set up so that profit is, ready to go when you get to a certain scale. And so we were not profitable to million ARR, but have kind of continued to scale and continue to grow, and see a very, very good future at this point with our scale of cash flow break even or profitable or whatever you want to say.
Gotcha. So as you were kind of building toward that, I mean, I've heard some people essentially say, don't hire another person until you can afford their salary.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, you're
I
kind of
think
fighting that battle. So yeah, how do you balance that out?
Again, I think it's just different in different markets. That is exactly what I did at my first company. Our thing
Right.
was, we won't hire a person unless we know that almost no matter what, we're going to keep them employed for a year. And that was a long sales cycle. You always had this big work backlog where you'd sell a deal, and then it would take 6 or 9 months to get it live. So it was a little easier in that market. That market was also, there are a couple companies since that have raised institutional capital in that market. But in my view, at least at the time, that wasn't a market where venture capital made a lot of sense because it was slow moving. Right. It was government. Nobody wants government, et cetera. So we bootstrapped that, and we did exactly what you said. When we get $1, we figure out to spend $1, and we just stayed basically cash flow break even from the day I started that company until, I don't know, for the first, I guess it would have technically been the first 12 years of that company. We were nothing but cash flow break even. And that's I think a completely valid way to grow a company. We got to a pretty decent scale doing that. Prismatic is a little bit on the other end of the spectrum. Big total addressable market. It's going very quickly. We have a solution that seems to work really well for our customers. You just want to put more fuel on the fire than you can get if all you're doing is just spending the dollar as the dollar comes in, especially in a SaaS world where everything's recurring and dollar figures are lower. So we did raise outside capital and just decided to forego profitability for a few years. And I think people did way too much of that in the last few years, but I think there's still very much a place for investing up front for a big win or a market leadership position in the end.
Right. No, that makes total sense. So it sounds like you have reasons why you went, I guess, cash flow neutral on the first company, and reasons why you saw that you wanted to go with the
100%.
With the investment capital, right? And it sounds like you kind of, you ran it for a while, and then once you'd kind of proven that there was a market there, then you went and raised the capital.
That's exactly.
So let's say that I'm building, a SaaS product for, I don't know, I'm not even going to make it up, plumbers, right?
Okay, there we go.
So I'm making a SaaS product for plumbers. How do I decide if this is something that, beyond sort of, I guess, my own personal ambitions with what the company should be, right? How do I decide if this is a good option for me to go get investment, or maybe get like an angel investor or somebody that's kind of a smaller investor that's just kind of going to give me a little more lift or a little more freedom to do what I need or whatever, or whether I just want to bootstrap the thing until forever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of like what will the market that you're in support? What's the size of that market, provided
Hmm.
that you win in the end? Obviously, it has to be a pretty decent sized market before
When you
the
say win
institutional
at the end,
capital.
what do you mean? Are you talking about
So
being the market leader?
yes,
Or
yes. So let's say you become the market leader. Is that a big enough position that
right,
that it's interesting to early institutional capital?
right. The
If
vast majority of plumbers use me.
Yeah, so if the vast majority of plumbers use you, I don't know, but I imagine there are a bajillion plumbers in the United
Right,
States. If the vast majority use you and you think you can get an average contract value of a certain amount, that market is going to be big enough that, like, as long as you can convince somebody that you have a shot of becoming the market leader, you're gonna get people who will give you capital early on, well, provided that they want to back the team and back the product and all of those things.
right.
If, on the other hand, what you say is, you know, we are going to serve we're going to serve plumbers by helping them with this one niche thing, and they're willing to pay us $100 a year for that. Well, that's great, and
Uh-huh.
you might be able to build a really great business for 4 people doing that, and you might even make a fortune doing it. But that's
Right.
probably not going to be a big enough business that any venture capital is going to be able to make a spreadsheet to say this business is worth $1 billion in the end. And so,
Okay.
you kind of end up in this in the in different paths depending on that part of your market. And then I think the other really important piece of it is, what do you actually want to do?
Hmm.
There are people who the last thing they want is to have a 500-person company that they're running. There are people where that's their dream, right? And so,
Right.
like, to some extent, it's what you want to do. And you mentioned before somebody deciding that they want to be 4 people or 5 people or whatever and just run that as a stable business. That isn't something you're going to raise money to do, but that doesn't make it not worth doing. It may very well
Right.
be exactly the right thing to do. It's just a very different path. Um,
Yep.
and I think you just have to be really clear with both yourself, your co-founders, your employees, everybody, what you're trying to do. And at Prismatic, we're trying to become the market leader, and we're well on our way at this point. But that meant early on we ran that business a little bit differently than we would have if we were instead driving to cash flow break even as fast as possible or something like that.
Right. That makes sense. So, just kind of heading into the raising capital, right? And it's funny because I've talked to people that are just they're entirely against raising capital. I've talked to other people that it's like the sooner I can raise capital, the sooner I can just make this thing take off. Right?
Yep.
It's like rocket fuel. Could be, depends on what you do with it, I think.
Yeah,
But
100%. Yes.
right. But at the end of the day, it's okay. So, but it sounds like you went the venture capital route.
Mhm.
So, how do you make that decision? What kinds of things did you have to do leading into raising capital? And then how do you actually get people to say, here's an enormous amount of money that, in exchange for an enormous chunk of your company, here's what we expect, go do your thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is so repeated, that it's a cliche at this point. But I actually believe that just about the most important thing is find people who are aligned with what you're trying to do,
Hmm.
that you can actually work with for the next 10 years. Like, what we all hear about the overnight success or whatever, and almost all
Right.
of them are 10 or 15 years in the making. So,
Right.
I think for me it was very much a find an investor that is aligned with what we want to do with the business, aligned with the way that we think about the world and want to run the business. Not that we're right or that they're right or anybody else is
Hmm.
wrong, but we better agree at least.
Right.
And so I very much wanted somebody who kind of aligned with the way we saw the world, and then somebody that for whatever reason believes the same thing we believe about our vision. And in the
Right.
case of our Series A and now Series B investor, a firm called Five Elms Capital, they had a lot of experience evaluating and researching essentially in this space. They're very
Mm.
interested in this space, and they knew a lot about this space, and they knew a lot about us. And we got to know them over a long period of time. And by the time it came time to raise the A, they were already really on board with the idea of this space becoming a real thing. And then, of course,
Uh-huh.
they've got to decide that we're the team that they want to back. We got to decide they're the team we
Right.
want to work with, and that goes both ways. But we alignment, alignment, alignment,
Mhm.
alignment. Misalignment with investors is the recipe for disaster almost always, I would argue.
Yeah, I would assume so. It sounds like when I hear people complain about their investors, yeah, the expectations between the two aren't
Yeah.
the same. And
Yeah.
so that makes sense.
I
Go ahead.
think if you go into it and don't know exactly what your investor is hoping the company turns into, or exactly the path that they hope it follows, not that it will, but at least what their
Uh-huh.
hope is, well, then you're already a lot, a lost cause basically from an alignment perspective.
Right.
And I think so many people just miss that part of the conversation. And to my view, that's just about the most important part.
Right. So how do you find an investor that aligns? Right? Did you just bump into him somewhere, or did you know him from something else, or
I
what? I'm,
actually,
I'm
I,
curious.
I think Five Elms probably actually had reached out to us, but long before we were ready to raise institutional capital.
Right.
Um, and we were far too small for them anyway. They're what's called a growth equity firm, so they kind of
Okay.
sit between venture capital and later stage private equity. So they're interested in businesses that have shown traction and are ready to really scale. And so, I think they reached out, but it was like a year or two before we were even going to be interested in having a conversation.
Okay.
Got to know them a little bit. Most founders of a business get those emails all the time, and you certainly don't talk to all of them, but you have a few
Hmm.
conversations along the way. And I think ideally, by the time it comes time to go raise a real round, you've got a handful of people where you know them, they know you, they know what you told them a year ago, and hopefully you can come
Right.
back today and say that that's what happened. And I think that kind of thing builds trust. And then you, I guess, evaluate your options and make a decision.
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like the common story, or at least the story that people tell, is they go to San Francisco and they go into 18 zillion boardrooms, and they make their pitch, and then they start working on the idea. And so, yeah, I like the idea more where it's, hey, look, this is where we want to go. This is where you want us to go. Right. You synergize, maybe you do have some serendipitous thing, or
Yep,
maybe they're
for
looking in
sure.
the market and they find you or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, that seems a lot more friendly, palatable,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I'm sure certainly there have been giant success stories with every
Oh,
path, right?
yes.
So, like,
Yeah.
I'm not here to say any path is wrong, but I do know that this has worked really well for us.
Yeah.
In my last business, which was a complicated story, but ended up acquired by private equity kind of twice. In that first private equity transaction, which was a pretty good sized transaction, it was one of those things where like we weren't even looking for capital,
Right.
and they found us, and I talked to them, and they had a viewpoint on that market, public safety market that aligned very well with ours, and all of a sudden it was, well, hey, this might actually be a pretty interesting way to accelerate this company,
Hmm.
and it worked out extremely well. But the only thing that got me interested when they first called was they said some things about that market that investors don't usually say, that happened to align with what I believed, and it was like, you know what, we should talk more.
Yep.
Stars and moons ended up aligning.
Yeah, I've had a few friends that have sold companies, and it's companies that they built from the ground up, and bootstrapped the whole way. And it seems like that's more commonly the way that it goes,
Yep.
right? Where somebody comes in and either they're ready to exit, and so the number lines up,
Yep.
or more frequently it's, hey, I'm already in this market, I address this market, there's something about what you have that makes what I have better.
Yep.
And so then they feel like they're handing it over to a good steward of what they've built and the people that work for their company.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, you want to talk about a time where alignment is what matters. My last thing, we acquired, I think, 5 businesses over the time
Hmm.
there, and the alignment between the business you're acquiring and what you intend to do is
Yeah.
100% correlated to how happy that founder is going to be in the end. And some people hear what they want to hear. Some people just want out but don't want to admit that. And some people actually want what you want out of the business, and that's good alignment. And I think, man, that's just another. I've learned that lesson from both sides many times. Alignment, alignment, alignment.
Yep. Yeah, well, and I worked for one company, just to give another example, and I'm not going to name them either. They're a large financial institution. Let's
Okay.
just put it that way. And this was the last full-time job that I had. I've been working contract since then. But they had acquired a company, and that company had acquired a company, and that company that they had acquired was, the third level down, was the division that I was working in.
Okay. Yeah.
And there was a complete mismatch of that kind of alignment as far as like how they would integrate and what they offered and the whole 9 yards, between the bottom level and the next level up. And that was causing issues between them and the final parent organization. And it made it extremely painful for everybody. And the people who had founded the company that initially got acquired before the parent company got acquired, they weren't happy with how any of it went, because eventually what wound up happening is that everybody who worked at that lower level division, lower level company, I mean, they all got laid off in a reduction of force, couple months ago, and so, yeah, it causes all kinds of issues, and everybody wants to take care of their people and feel like they contributed, and it makes it hard to see that not continue in the way that you'd hoped, and see it hurt people that you've invested in. So, yeah.
Been on both sides of that, I suppose, over the years. So
Yeah. So yeah. So I'm not sure if there are other things that we need to go into. Are there other parts of this that I'm just not seeing, not having gone through what you've gone through?
Good question. You've certainly hit on some of the big points that I guess I would think of. Yeah, I think there's, if you think about somebody in the kind of really early stages of starting a SaaS, especially who hasn't done it before, I think there's always the question around, like, when you formalize a sales function as opposed to have it be founder led. I think that's such a big turning point for a company. It's kind of the first time you prove that this might be a scalable thing with real traction. I think that's always a really scary thing for just about every founder. And,
Yeah.
and I think is sometimes the difference between going to become a scale business and staying instead a kind of like stable, smaller thing, as you were describing before. Because it turns out one person can't sell, $100 million of software every year. So, if you're gonna get to scale, you've gotta figure out how to systematize that stuff.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. How do you do that? Right. Because I mean, at one point I was bringing in like $400,000 in sponsorship sales on the podcast. And I kept thinking, man, can I hire somebody to do this so I can do the other pieces of this? And I could just never figure out how to make that click.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard question. I was fortunate in this business that I was able to bring in a CRO that I had worked with, kind of from like 30-ish million to 50 million at the old thing. And so I had a lot of trust,
Right.
for him, and he knew me for better or for worse. And we just kind of went at it together once we were kind of, close to 1 million or so here. But man, if I'd had to hire that person cold, I honestly don't know what I'd have done. That'd have been a terrifying outcome. I suppose I would have, built some director level people under me for a while or something, and eventually try to bring in a real sales leader. But the really good ones have so many good opportunities that unless you happen to have some relationship where they really believe what you're doing, pretty hard to get a really good sales leader to come in at $1 million ARR. That's they're often businesses 100 times that size doing great things. And so I feel like I kind of got off easy on that particular point at Prismatic.
Yeah, well, that's why they call him the chief revenue officer, is because they bring in the money, and
that's
if they know what they're doing, it makes a major difference.
It's an impossible job to do well, and the ones that manage to do it well are very rare and not on the market very often. So that's a tough one, and I think that kind of thinking, are you ready to systematize these various functions? I think sales is maybe a really good example, but you kind of have it across the business. Are you ready to systematize those things? I think that's really a super key inflection point in whether a business is going to get to scale. Is like the extent to which you've invested in the things that are going to make that systematizable before you need to do it. And I think businesses are actually getting better at some of those things because of just all the conventional wisdom that's out there now. But Salesforce on day one of a company, or whatever sales tracking tool you're going to use, CRM you're going to use, is I think more common than it was, but a huge mistake if you don't do it, because you end up 2 years down the road, it's time to bring in a sales leader, and they're coming in and building something from nothing instead. So I think every little decision like that along the way has big, big ramifications when you're starting to bend that curve of scale.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping us up.
Yeah.
If people want to connect with you, if they want to check out Prismatic, I mean,
Yeah.
what are the best places for that?
Find me or Prismatic on LinkedIn, or you can go to our website at prismatic.io.
All right. Good deal. We'll wrap it up here, folks. Until next time, Max out.
Thank you.
All right. Hang on for a second.